I know you were listening in on the NTSB's press conference earlier today. A lot of new details there. What stands out to you?
Well, I think, Emily, I'm glad to be here. And I think what stands out to me most is how slow the airplane got on final. It got 30% below the reference speed, which is the minimum speed it should have been at, 50 feet above the runway. So it's hard to imagine what would have allowed the aircraft to slow down that much.
So why might that have happened?
Well, certainly the NTSB is going to be looking at the aircraft itself to make sure there wasn't something wrong with the aircraft. And they're going to spend a lot of time now that they've had the interviews with the pilots, trying to correlate the data they have from the flight data recorder, the cockpit voice recorder information, which is the conversation in the cockpit, and what the pilots say they did. So the board is going to be trying to correlate that to find out if the pilots perhaps had the wrong mode selected on the aircraft, or were distracted by something, or if there was something else going on. Normally there would be no reason for the aircraft to get that slow on an approach.
So you say that there's one thing that nobody is talking about or has not talked about yet. What is that?
Well, you know, there has been focus on the electronic glide slope being out. The instrument landing system for that runway was disabled because of some construction. What people don't understand is that there was a backup procedure published for that runway using next-gen technologies that don't require a ground-based system at all, available for that crew to use. So had they decided to do it, they could have selected that procedure and could have flown the aircraft using technology in order to be more stabilized on approach. The other thing is there were also a set of lights at the end of the runway that would assist them in making sure they are on the right angle. There are onboard systems that can draw a vertical line that gets them to the right point on the runway. So there was lots of electronics that could have helped. But we would expect a basic piloting skill to be able to get the airplane at the right speed at the touchdown point, which in this case is 1,000 feet from the end of the runway.
So then, in your view, would you say that at this point it looks like pilot error was a factor here?
Well, I certainly think that's a focus. As I said, the board is going to be looking to make sure that nothing was wrong with the airplane. And so far, from what they've seen, they haven't given any indication that they have found a malfunction on the airplane. You know, they're going to continue to look at things like the environment, which I think they have just about ruled out at the airplane. And then, of course, human performance, the pilot's performance is going to be a focus. And you know, the investigation is not going to only focus on that, but certainly that's an area they're going to be looking very closely at.
How about this, John? Would you say that it's not looking good for the crew right now?
Well, I certainly think that the highest probability would be that that the crew somehow didn't intervene when the aircraft started to get that slow. 30% below the minimum speed the airplane should have been at. That's very significant, as you've heard the board say. There are indications on the aircraft that alert the crew. The person flying, there's also been some attention paid to the fact that this pilot was doing his initial operational experience flights, and he had 40-some-odd hours. In the U.S., it's only 25 hours, and even that can be reduced. So before you get in the seat, you're fully qualified in the airplane, you have a type rating, you're completely signed off, and then you get the operating experience with the airline. Had he been a U.S. pilot, likely he would have been signed off already.
So then I guess back to the original question, which is, you know, if the speed slowed down so greatly, why wouldn't the pilots have intervened?
That's the real question. You know, you've heard people talk about the previous accident in England where the engines didn't spool up. In this case, it appears the engines spooled up normally and were creating thrust. It's hard to imagine, unless they became distracted by something, that they would allow the speed to deteriorate that far. Now, that being said, it deteriorated pretty quickly. It looked like the airplane, if you look at the video from one of the eyewitnesses, it looked like the airplane pitched up pretty quickly, and so airspeed bleeds off quite quickly in that kind of maneuver. But no matter what, the airspeed was not managed on that approach.
Now, there are some critics out there who say that pilots these days rely too much on technology to help land planes. And yet I was speaking with Mary Schiavo earlier, former Inspector General for the Department of Transportation. She seems to think that if the glide slope indicator had been on, that could have prevented this entirely. Where do you weigh in on this?
Well, I don't think so. Again, the fact is that there were other methods, including lights at the end of the runway, which are the primary reference in visual conditions to make sure you're on the right path, that were working. So they had an indication, a visual indication that they weren't on the right path. There has to be a balance between pilots hand flying the aircraft and using technology. Technology allows the aircraft to be more stable. It allows us to put airplanes closer together in bad weather conditions safely. But we have to make sure there's enough training for pilots to have the skill to be able to land the aircraft manually when they need to. Right now, we think the balance is struck at the right place, but certainly it'll be looked at again in light of this accident.